So today, we're looking at, well, I think I called the lecture something like What to Do About Genesis. What to Do About Genesis. And of course, when I put this out there, I'm buying into the Bible organization of the study of ancient Israel. And I told you, on one hand, as the class began, that this is a question. Like, we could run a class on ancient Israel that tried to be completely organized by archaeology. For one, I'm not an archaeologist, so I wouldn't be working from my own strengths if I tried to do that. But also, I just think that a lot of the reason that people find ancient Israel still important is connected to at least these kind of cultural communities that have the religious component to them, Jewish and Christian. And the Bible is so much part of that. And also the Bible gives us words, it gives us names, it gives us identities and stories and a sort of scheme of things that to try to do a history of ancient Israel or a study of the culture of ancient Israel without any attention to the Bible would be a kind of a weird exercise as well. So I've gone ahead and embraced it, even as I've approached each part of this Bible story carefully. So today, we're going to come back to this Genesis component. And we did this a little bit before when I said I was going to talk to you about shepherds and nomads. And we talked about just kind of the basic structure of society and the notion in Genesis that the ancestors were these shepherds on the move. And I said that I thought there really is something to that in terms of a memory about Israel's origins being connected to people of this sort. But today I want to come back and look at another angle, another aspect of Genesis, what I think is the most important part of Genesis. And so the way we're going to lay out the rest of the class is in a second, but not quite yet. I have a goal for the class. I didn't purposely start doing this, but it seemed to work, to begin a class with a statement of what I want you to know this is about. So I'm going to try to keep doing that. And then I wanted to go over Petard, the rest of the article, right, that I wanted you to read for this class. It's the second half of the first chapter of the history. I want you to see what he's doing. On one hand, it's just really useful. If anybody talks about the background to Israel, what is known about the ancient world before Israel that relates to Israel, he's just giving you real basics. If somebody mentions the name Mari or Amarna or Ugarit, if I say it in class, or if one of your section instructors brings it up, or it comes up in a reading for a paper, then go to Petard, right? He tells you what the things are and what's been found there that's important. But I do want you to step back and get a sense of how he's approaching the world before Israel shows up on the scene. And I have a couple of points. And then I'll come to the main event in terms of primary evidence. I've tried to build our class sessions around looking together at some piece of actual evidence. And today that's going to be from the book of Genesis. And it's going to be, I told you to read chapters 28 to 31. I don't know if you all got to it, but I hope so. In the midst of that, I'm actually going to take what at the surface might seem the least interesting part of it, which is what I'll call the birth narrative. There's a story embedded in the middle. It's like a big pause in the action almost, where you have to explain how all of Jacob's sons were born and one daughter, Dinah. This is actually really, really important. In fact, in some ways, that birth story is the most important part of Genesis, the entire book of Genesis. And I want you to look at it with me. And then we'll kind of come back around to my own sort of list of takeaways, what I want you to get out of this reflection on Genesis. But before I even give you my goal for today's class, I wanted to ask you a question. Now, again, this is a little bit, I know that you're coming from a lot of different places. Some of you have never even read any of this stuff in the Bible, and I didn't demand that you do a kind of project, read all of Genesis and come with questions. So, some of you may find it easier to answer this question than others. But my start off was just, I wanted to get you to help me a little bit with the entire concept of talking about Genesis and history. And I just wanted to get a feel from you for what you think you want to know. And so if I say, all right, there's a question out there, in case you didn't know, there are many scholars who doubt that you can get history from Genesis. At least a couple of people I've talked to about the chapter in the Oxford History said, oh, Petard says there's no history in Genesis. You just got to look at all this other stuff. And I thought, whoa, that's interesting, because Petard's among the much more accepting of the interest of Genesis for history than a lot of people. I mean, you want to see skepticism? I could get you some skepticism. But I didn't assign that reading. So that said, what's the issue here? Anybody? So here's this book. It's got a story. I won't repeat the whole thing for you, right? But and in a way, let's not even worry. Don't tell me, okay, what's the archaeological evidence for the flood? Because that's a whole problem of itself. I mean, the stories about creation and the flood and the Tower of Babel, I'm going to just shelve. But the larger part of Genesis is this story of ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This whole because that's where we start talking about Israel, really. And so, what do you need to know? If I say there's an issue, how would you even begin to ask about the relationship between Genesis and history? Go ahead.
How could an entire nation grow out of 12 sons?
Okay, so that's an interesting way to put it. I'll repeat what he said. How could a whole nation grow out of 12 sons? Right. So there's various ways you could sort of rephrase this question, and this question, in a way, is absolutely going to be central to this whole session that we do today. One key part of the picture, the part that the birth story is about, is the notion that Jacob has this family, and then so there are 12 sons that are described, and then those 12 sons are identified with what are known elsewhere in the Bible, even in Genesis itself, as 12 tribes, so that you have Israel made up of these different groups that are related as family. And so Genesis kind of presents each one of these tribes as having what I'll call an eponymous ancestor. You like that word? Did I remember to bring my dry erase marker? I shelved the other one. I'll bring it someday when I'm feeling like a prankster, sort of like a graffiti artist. I'll write stuff on the board here, and someone else will have to go to enormous work to erase it. Which just means that the tribe is named for an individual person. So these are the eponymous ancestors of the tribes. The idea is that each tribe is actually named for a person, with the notion being that they represent an actual family. I mean, this is the picture, at least, and that that the tribe of Joseph had an actual original forefather named Joseph, and that they were all related. So for sure, this is important as a concept. How do you think about that as history? Is that just how it worked? It's one couple, or a couple of maidservants thrown in, and the next thing you know, you got a whole nation? But of course, then the question is, how do you approach that to try to check it out historically? We don't have birth records, go check all the birth certificates or something in all the villages, or, So for one, there's a question about how you'd even investigate that. Good question, though. What else is out there? History, Genesis. Think of something? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I guess the kind of obvious one would be
Obvious is good.
the creation story has anything to do with the actual creation of the earth, or where you stand
Right.
in that historical.
So that's kind of the part that I shelved. But the way that's all right. But the reason that it's good to put it on the table, I suppose, in part would be, I mean, when you read it and you say, okay, it says 7 days, and then it's not really, I mean, you think, how does that work? And there are various theological kind of solutions. God, for God, 7 days are not the same as for us. And of course, the sun isn't even created till the fourth day. And there's all sorts of interesting ways to talk about that. But right off, it doesn't just look like science. And so it does help a bit, even to go all the way back to the creation. And they don't separate it. Like for them, as they're telling the history of Israel, they start their history of Israel with creation of the world. And they see that as part of the same history that brings you down to, to Jacob and his sons. And talk about checking out a family. That's their explanation for the whole universe, right? They give you this genealogy that goes back to Adam as the first person. And that's how they see all of humanity, as a family, which is, kind of a cool concept in a way, but also kind of hard to track. But so I'll allow this on the table slightly in that it gives you a sense of the way they're viewing history. Go ahead.
If you compare Genesis to these archives, though, how do you know when you can take it face value in each of those works?
In the other archives or in Genesis? In both, yeah. So there's a good question just generally. I like the observation. How do you know when you're reading this writing, whether it's from the Bible and Genesis, or whether it's from Ugarit, or the letters from Elamarna, or some story? They have stories like Adapa that we read from Babylon that was found in Amarna. Also, how do you know what to take at face value, and what does face value mean? And part of the answer is that it depends on the genre, which means what kind of writing is this, in what setting, for what purpose. So if you're writing a letter that has a very practical sort of purpose, you could say, well, that's not going to be the same as a story, like a myth or story or something like that, which has a different kind of purpose. Might have a different purpose from a royal inscription that was propaganda, more or less. And yet both the royal inscription and the letter would be very close to the time, right? They're coming right out of the time, but it's like reading either the newspaper or a leaflet, a pamphlet, or online ad. What would you say, right? How do you know that you have to believe their point of view, even if it's current? And then, of course, with the Bible, the issue is that you're reading stuff that's part of a compilation that's been passed on and on and on. And so it's much more removed from the time they're describing. So in a way, I just leave your question out there, which is that I am not advocating that the Bible be doubted and everything else be trusted. I'm actually saying that we should approach all of our written evidence, and in a way our non-written evidence as well, as something to be interrogated. So where you ask, what can we know, what can't we know? Another question, idea? Yeah.
Yeah, there's also the sort of problem that there's two, as far as the story of creation, there's like two versions of it.
Yeah, so that's reintroducing the part that I was trying to shelve, but let me use it again. That's okay, I'm just hassling you. So the thing is that, so there are these two stories. There's the one of 7 days, and then there's a focus on Adam and Eve, or first Adam and then Eve, and we read that, right? And the thing that's interesting is that the second story, the one that's about the Garden of Eden, doesn't seem to really be based on the first story. It doesn't talk about humanity being made in the image of God, which is how the first chapter went. And it seems to start almost from scratch, as if you didn't really have anything yet. And I suppose if you learn something from that, one thing you learn is to expect a kind of complicated Genesis story, that you're dealing possibly with stories from more than one place, not just one mind, one person organizing everything. And that's going to affect the stories about the characters. So let me move on. But I mean, a little bit you can start to see what some of the questions are. But so you have this story about a family, and you have these ancient characters that are supposed to be ancestors, and they're said to have started, it actually says that Abraham comes from Ur, which is this city that really did exist, and really did exist way, way back in time. It's near Babylon. It's actually closer to the Persian Gulf, downstream from Babylon. And it says he started at Ur, and then it says, and this is all very quickly done. It says he goes to a place called Haran, not Abraham actually, but his family before him. They move out of Ur to a place called Haran, and you think, well, I don't know this geography very, very well. And we'll get there, to put it on the screen yet. We'll have a map in a second, or a few minutes. And so Haran is actually it's in modern Turkey, even near the border of Syria, closer to the Mediterranean Sea than way down Iraq. And so his whole family moves up into northern Syria, effectively. And that's where Abraham is told to move and get down to the land that's going to belong to his descendants. So then you get Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and they have these various adventures, and you talk about them going to these various places. But the big picture, I suppose, might be, can you really believe the picture? That you have all this whole people that would be descended from this one guy and his family. And we'll come back to this, right? Because this is a big question. And at the end of Petard, he actually says, well, the problem with history and Genesis is that, of course, we can't believe that. I mean, that Israel's actual origin can't be viewed so simply. So let's ask other questions instead. But in fact, I think this issue of Israel being viewed as a family deserves another look. And that's going to be my goal for today. So here is my class goal in one sentence. To suggest that Genesis has enormous importance for reconstructing the history of Israel, if we think more deeply than the existence of its characters. Because, one of the first questions people would ask would be, well, the family question was a nice way to put it, but was there a Jacob? Was there an Isaac? Was there an Abraham? Was there a Joseph? And a Dan, and an Asher, and a Gad, and a Naphtali, and these other names that you may or may not know. Those are the tribes, the sons. Yeah, go ahead. Yes. So here's the class goal. To suggest that Genesis has enormous importance for reconstructing the history of Israel. Basic statement. So, and I'll finish it in a second, right? So that's the first half of the sentence. But that's the most important part, to suggest that Genesis has enormous importance for reconstructing the history of Israel. And I mean that as an historian. I'm not just saying that to be nice, you might say, or to be gullible. I really think Genesis has enormous importance for reconstructing the history of Israel. It is historically important information that we don't have anywhere else. It's only because we have the Bible and have Genesis that we can know something really important about the character and origin of Israel. So the rest of the statement was, if we think more deeply than the existence of its characters. To suggest that Genesis has enormous importance for reconstructing the history of Israel if we think more deeply than the existence of its characters. There's no way, for one, that you're going to get any information about these people, whether they existed or didn't. And even if you did let's say you found some letter from Abraham or something like that, it still would improve the picture that you'd asked about. How can you imagine everybody really being descended from this one person? Okay, so he might have existed. It doesn't make it any easier to have the whole, people of Israel as one literal family. So whatever. And you could say, no, but I don't see why you couldn't. And I want to see it that way. I'm going to believe it that way. And you can still do well in this class, don't worry. So I'm not going to necessarily try to force you off that. But historically, there are other ways to think about this family organization, and we'll talk about them. But it's really important for understanding the nature of early Israel. And this is what today's all about. Now, let me start with Petard. And at this point, I'm just going to talk a little bit. And then we'll get to Genesis 29 and 30, the story of the births of all of Jacob's sons, and give you a chance to pitch in. Partly, with this, I want to give you a sense to reflect on Petard. You can imagine, as I'm putting together class sessions, on one hand, I want something interactive. I want a chance to talk to you. I think it's more interesting that way. And the best way to do that is to put some evidence up there and get your reactions. But at the same time, as I ask you to read certain things, I want you to feel like I've been reading that stuff too, and am wanting to bring certain things to your attention. So this is the reading acknowledgement section of class. Now, Petard talks about what he calls the ancestral narratives in the Bible. So in a way, I'm starting with the very end of his chapter, the very end of his essay. And he says that there's little data, there are little data, there is more theology than history, and that the picture of descent from a single couple is simply untrue. Right? So this is, in just a paragraph, Pittard gives you this kind of reflection on Genesis. And again, I know him. He's a wonderful guy, very good scholar, fantastic teacher, I hear, too. But at some simple level, I'm gonna disagree with him. And in a way, I think if I talked to him, he'd actually agree with me. But it wasn't what his project was in writing this chapter. And all he was trying to do was say, well, you can't just say, here's the picture, it's just this family. So I get his point. But the danger here is thinking that when you pose the question that way, are you to explain the whole people of Israel as literal descendants from this couple? Is that it for the historical question? If it's true, great, it's historical. If it's not true, it's not historical. And what I'm saying is that whether or not it's true, and absolutely if it's not true literally, it is still extremely important historically. And I'll tell you what I mean. Meanwhile, hold that thought. What does Pittard tell us about what I'm going to call the Levant, right? So this is the sort of band of land that runs through Lebanon and what's now Israel along the Mediterranean. What does Pittard tell us about the Levant? Levant. Levant in the late Bronze Age. You with me on the dates, right? Pittard explained all this stuff, and he talks about the Middle Bronze and the Late Bronze. The Late Bronze is from what are the dates? Say roughly 1550 to 1200, or at least those are the traditional dates. So the later part of the second millennium. And this is what I want you to see, what his categories are. This is not literally what he said, but what are the categories he uses to talk to you about the Late Bronze Age? So if you'll remember, he starts with empires. I don't know if you caught this, all right? So there are 5. And I might as well write them up since I have a dry erase marker. Egypt, Hatti, and if you want to be really cool, say it with a rough H. Hatti. Mitanni, actually I got distracted, really it's a separate one. So 1, 2, 3. And then the other ones are the eventual bad guys of Israel's life, Babylon and Assyria, which already existed in Iraq. So pretty much of these, Egypt's in Egypt, Hatti is in Turkey, sort of occupies most of Turkey. Babylon and Assyria are in Iraq, with Assyria being more north, Babylon being near Baghdad. And Mitanni, nobody knows exactly where its capital was, but it's kind of in between. It's in northern Syria. It would be near the Syria-Iraq border. It would be a region, part of it would be kind of Kurdish region, if you ever are aware of that. It was when you hear about Anbar province in the history of our recent conflict in Iraq, that would be partly Mitanni. So these would be the 5 big kingdoms, and he calls them empires, right? And it is interesting that this is a time when these 5 powers really kind of dominated the region, and they divided the land up between them as best they could. They didn't totally succeed. And then he talks about smaller states, and he uses the category of state, which would be a formal academic category for kingdoms of a certain size and a certain level of complexity, that they'd pass on, that they have real institutions that outlive a given generation. That they're organized with administrations, even though they might be smaller. And then he talks about coastal cities. He's kind of zeroing in on the land of Israel as well, which would include places like, I mean, in fact, Ugarit that he mentions is one of these coastal cities. There's Beirut, which is still Beirut. It was already a really important place. And then I don't know if you've ever heard of these places, Tyre and Sidon, which are part of what later was called Phoenicia. These were famous merchants and Greek traders, seamen. So he talks about these. And then, in a way that I thought was kind of funny, he talked about small, weak city-states. And you think, well, who gets to be a small, weak city-state? Well, if you're in what became Israel, you get to be a small, weak city-state. All the good states are somewhere else. So those include, so Chatzor, which at least once upon a time was a little bigger. I mean, almost a small state, not a small, weak city-state. And then, Jerusalem, say, would have made it to Pitard's list of small, weak city-states, which I won't dispute. I mean, in the grand scheme, he's probably right. It's down the pecking order pretty far. But here's the interesting thing, right? I mean, so everything that he has set for you is defined in terms of kingdoms and cities, right? Everything defined by kingdoms and cities. So we'll come back to that. So his categories are kingdoms and cities. His chronology is built around what I call the rise and fall of empires. So if you just read the chapter and you think, what's the story here? The story is how Egypt began to get an empire that included what would be the land of Israel. Do you remember that part? And then how eventually they kind of lost that. And then meanwhile, there's this Hatti kingdom, which is, they're also called the Hittites. That's just the adjective. And it talks about how they got to be more powerful and they took over some of Egypt's land. And he talks about Mitanni, how they started off powerful and they lost ground to everybody else. And right, it's the whole thing is like who's getting stronger, who's getting weaker. That's his chronology, which is fine. I mean, that's actually, again, this is not a criticism at all. But I want you to realize what's not there when he's painting this picture for you. So just wait, we'll get there. And then finally, he talks about major evidence for the land that would become Israel from two archives, both of which are in city centers. One is Amarna, which we talked about. That's the old capital of Egypt for a while. And the other is this place called Ugarit. I'm not going to write it up there. It's in the book all over the place. And the reason that these are so important is that Amarna, because it has all these letters from all of the little centers that Egypt controlled, it gives you kind of a map of what the world looked like in this area before Israel, which is a great kind of control. And then the reason Ugarit is so important is that if you look at the world of this late Bronze Age, the writing is either in Egyptian, and that's mostly in Egypt, or it's in Akkadian, which is the language of Babylon. And like I said, this is the international language. That's why we had this Oedipus story. The scribes had to be trained to use this language. But still, I mean, it's not their own culture. So for a complicated set of reasons that Aaron will explain, because he's writing his dissertation on it, right? Ugarit ended up with a kind of writing system that was separate from the normal cuneiform, which they used to write their own language in. And they had kind of a preference when they were talking about their own culture to use this different script in their own language. And it's the only place in the entire ancient world where we have this for anything near the world of Israel. So you have people writing in their own language, talking about their own culture and their own religion and their own politics, I guess, right? So this stuff becomes really interesting because it's the only thing that gives us that. But again, it's a city. It's a big center. And that's the way people tell the history of the world before Israel. In this picture, there's very little connection for Genesis with any of that stuff. If you read Genesis, there's no sense of empire. I mean, you meet Egypt briefly if you go read the book of Genesis, but you'd never know that the people of Egypt actually control this area. I mean, you could say, well, maybe the story is from before when Egypt controlled it. But for whatever reason, Egypt is just another outside kingdom. There's no other powers. There's just the locals. There's the local Canaanite towns, and there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can check out the towns, and archaeologists have. Some of them seem to have been occupied and can be located in some old time that would fit before Israel, and some of them can't. And you can argue about why. But I don't know. So what do you have? No reference to the empires. You can check out the towns, but there's really nothing that you can know that much about them in terms of connection to Genesis. So what? Does that mean there's nothing you can tell to check out the historical value of Genesis? So my proposal is to listen to the texts and ask, what are they saying about history? And with this, I want to do just that. So, Mari. So we brought along Genesis 29 to 30, and I asked you to read it in advance, but let's talk about it. So for quick review, while Mari's getting this warmed up. Right, so you're introduced to Abraham as this guy who's told to leave where he lives up in Syria, and he's supposed to go down to the area, to some place that he doesn't even know. So he ends up down there in what's sometimes called Canaan, and he moves around to various places. He has a lot of trouble having a son, and so it's a big deal that he can't have a son because God said, your descendants are going to be like the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. But it's a little hard to do that if you haven't even had one kid. So the whole idea is, well, don't worry, God will provide that one kid. It'll all happen. The one kid that counts at least ends up being this guy, Isaac. So then you have just a little bit of attention to Isaac, and then quickly that moves on to the fact that Isaac has two twin sons, Esau, E-S-A-U, being the older by however many minutes, and Jacob being the one that's going to get the credit in the end. Now, the problem is that Jacob turns out to be both a kind of a guy who likes to hang around in tents. If you thought of that Mari letter, then Esau could write to Jacob and say some of the same things that whatever his name was, Chami Ishtamar, wrote to Yasmachadu. But in fact, Jacob seems to be pretty aggressive when it comes to getting hold of his brother's possessions. And so he gets a hold of the big thing is he tricks his father, their father, into giving him the paternal blessing that will somehow really count to make him be the one who is the true heir. And so his father only does it because he thinks he's talking to Esau. But it works. Once he says the blessing, then it can't be taken back. So at that point, Esau's natural reaction is to kill him, right? Like, what else would you do? So Jacob figures, I'm out of here, right? And so off he goes up to his mother's family, which is way up in Syria. And then there's this whole thing. He meets his lovely distant cousin and wants to marry her. And then he gets tricked himself into getting married to the older sister, but eventually gets the one he wants. These are Leah and Rachel. And then eventually, after years and years of living up there, he goes back. And you get reintroduced to Esau, and they kind of make up. But in the midst of all this, not only then does he get his two wives back up in Syria, but they start to have kids. And so when you get to this point right here, this would be where we would start. Mari kindly included this note, at least above. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. Well, we're going to come back to these maids, these servants. But really the story begins with verse 31. When the Lord, so this is going to be Yahweh, rendered as, this is the way they handle that tradition of not speaking the name, saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bore a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked on my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. And on it goes. I mean, she has another son, Simeon. She has another son, Levi, wherever we are. And then she has another son, Judah. She has 4 sons. And with each one, they give you a little saying to go with the naming. So then you get to the beginning of chapter 30, and it says, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, so now it's keeping score. Leah 4, Rachel 0. It's not going very well for the Rachel crowd. So then she has this kind of discussion with her husband. It's the obvious thing to do. Again, they're always just doing the obvious thing. Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children. She envied her sister, and she said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Like, what do you want? The poor guy says. Like, I don't know, I'm doing my part. But it's just not happening. So, they didn't really have doctors back then who could handle this sort of thing. So, not that it works nowadays either necessarily. So, Jacob became very angry with Rachel and said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So she said, okay, all right, here's my maid, Bilhah. Go in to her. You sort of get what that means. That she may bear upon my knees, which is an interesting kind of cultural sort of image of this, and that I too may have children through her. So she gave him her maid Bilhah's wife, and Jacob went into her, and Bilhah was fine. She bore Jacob a son. So whose problem is it here anyway? So Rachel said, God has judged me and has heard my voice. So she feels like, okay, at least it's like 4 to a half, right? It may not be a full score, but at least she feels like she got something out of this deal. So she has 2 kids. She has this Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah says, hey, wait a minute. And isn't it my turn? But the funny thing is the way the story goes. Instead of thinking, all right, I'm going to have more kids, she took her maid, so she has one too, and she thinks, okay, if this works for my sister, it'll work for me. And she gets 2 more sons. So now we're going to be up to 8 if you're counting, and you should be, because the number 12 is always really important in the story. So you get, what is this? This is now going to be Gad and Asher. And then you get down to verse 14, and it says, in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field, this sexy plant, for some reason, and brought them to his mother, Leah. And Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, well, then he may lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. I think, okay, this is how it works, huh? So Jacob came in from the field in the evening, and Leah said, okay, it's like my turn now. And she actually manages to have 2 more kids, 2 more sons in particular, and it mentions a daughter. And then finally, you have to get all the way down to the end, and it says, then God remembered Rachel, and God heeded her and opened her womb, if you follow the tracking. And it is now all the way up. Okay. That's okay. And she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. And then interestingly, so in a way in that, there's 2 sayings, right? So she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And then she named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. So, counting, how many do we have? 11. Where's the 12th? So, what was you going to say? It's later. Where is it in this passage? The second Joseph saying. You see it? May the Lord add to me another son. Right? So it's anticipated, you could say. But it's very important that it's, so you can read through this whole story and you only have 11. You have 11 sons, with Joseph being the long-awaited. And the one that's missing is Benjamin. And we'll come back and talk a little bit about Benjamin. But, okay, so here's the basic story. Well, I called it a story. So here is my first question. Is it a story? Right? So like everything else around it was a story. Argument between Jacob and Esau, negotiations over getting the two wives, Leah being unloved, Jacob tries to get rich. It's a whole separate story. And then you get down to here, and in a way you could say, well, it looks almost like a list, just trying to get this one, and then that one, and then that one. So what is your sense of what this is? Is it a story? And if it's a story, what connects it? Because this is actually going to be important to know whether you should make sure that you're reading it as a unity. Is it a unity? And what makes it a unity? What do you see? What holds it together? I know you can't look at it all at once. Not quite. Yeah, why don't you back it up a little bit? How about its characters? So do you get the feeling in the story that the first time you meet these characters would be in this story? Like, so in this story, who might be introduced for the first time? Yeah.
Rachel and Leah.
Well, so you could wonder that, and I didn't have you, I didn't put the whole thing up there. In fact, it's not true. I mean, they have been introduced already. Go all the way back to one more line up, right? So you see how how does the story begin? When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So even if you hadn't read anything above that opening line alone assumes something that came before. You follow? Right? That Jacob loves Rachel and not Leah. There's some kind of backstory that you don't know yet as you start. But that already, the very first thing you find out as you begin reading this story is that Leah gets to have 4 kids, and the narrator explains it by God kind of being nice to her because she's not getting a very good deal from her husband. Yeah, go ahead.
The son or the children are all named for the first
So there you go. I wasn't even thinking along that line, but that's great. That's like the number one category. They're all named for the first time. Absolutely, I like that idea. That with the sons, you figure this is the first time you've met these characters, and they're set up that way. They're born, they're named. There's no way you would have thought they existed before. But this is important, right? To kind of pick that out and realize that's different from Rachel and Leah, whom you have met before. Did you have an idea? Yeah, go ahead.
The maids are also named for the first time.
Yeah, so that was I was wondering about them. In fact, there are notes in the text that are provided. There's the one that Mari included in parentheses. Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. And there is another note for what's her name? The other one, Bilhah and Zilpah or something. So anyway, but in fact, again, you have to decide if you go with me on this. But given that the thing has this kind of archival, combined nature to it, then one of the things that biblical scholars often ask is whether the kind of editors of this, who put it together, sometimes provided notes so that you get how things connected. And so when you see these little notes, by the way, Laban gave, his daughter's servants, it feels like an explanation in advance for this story. Right, that in the story, they're introduced like, oh, we need somebody to provide another son. And so they feel much more like they didn't have a role except in this story. So from that point of view, then sort of Rachel, Leah, and Jacob, who are the main characters, seem already to have been introduced. And there's a kind of a storyline that follows them, right? So what's the storyline of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah that ties this together? Is there one? Yeah, go ahead again. Yeah, go ahead.
You mean like how he came to like the original before this?
No, in the story. Like so if you look at it actually inside this story, is there a story? And I mean, I'll say there is a story. There's a thread that connects the whole thing. I kind of played it up as I gave you the resume. Go ahead.
They're competitive with each other.
They're competitive. Yeah, so there's a competition which is tied to what? You want to follow up? It's like a game show. That
Having children.
having children, yeah. But go ahead.
The nations being, the tribes being competitive with each other.
So that's a sort of a spin-off, at least. I mean, there's a good, well, so hold that, make me come right back to you after this in a second, because I want to, that's important. I want to first deal with the story aspect, and then I want to come right back. So what's the issue in the competition? Go ahead.
Well, they both want Jacob's love.
They both want Jacob's love, right? So in a purely narrative sense, then they're competitive, and the thing they're after is their husband's love, and which is so interesting, right? And touching in a way, right? As you read this, and they read, what a horrible situation, right, for a woman, right? They read both, I don't know, the condition of their relationship to their husband and their kind of larger existential situation in relation to God, according to whether they've been able to have children or not. Although, then, the one who can't, who you might say has suffered the most, is the one who's struck it rich in terms of her husband's attitude toward her. And, of course, the earlier story told you that she's the one that was most wanted in the beginning, and that Leah was just an add-on, which is a great job, right? Oh, yeah, their dad decided, I don't want to marry the younger one before the older one, so Leah, you go in. And she's going, I don't want to. I don't want to be the second choice wife. You don't get to hear that part of the story. But in a way, you can feel it when you get to this part, when she's thinking, what kind of deal have I got? Well, at least God says, I'll give you sons, which in that day really defined a woman's place in the world. That if you had children, that was your future. That was your status. That was your life. They represented you in the world. And if you failed to, then no matter how much you might be cared for, your position in the world was tenuous. So there's this weird mix. Yeah? Go ahead.
Having children or having boys?
Yeah, that's a good question. She said having children or having boys. And absolutely, it would be especially boys. And this is a whole side conversation that at some point we'll touch on this at a couple points in the class in terms of what's going on with women. One of the very interesting things about non-biblical ancient stuff is that we have a lot of legal documents that in cuneiform, Akkadian especially, and a certain number of these legal documents involve women. Women who are passing on their wealth, women who are inheriting the full wealth. And so one of the things you could ask is, well, if everything's about boys, what happens when it's like Pride and Prejudice and you have only 5 girls? You got to make some good marriages. I mean, that's what Pride and Prejudice is about. Not so crazy as a comparison. And yet, that's not always the route they would go. They wouldn't just marry them off. There are cases where you would get the girls inheriting, or the wife inheriting and then it going on to the girls. And it's fascinating that you might think, well, if it's a male-only world and the only deal is having sons, then there's just no place for the women unless they get married. And it's not totally true. So yeah, sons, but not totally. Okay, so here's the family part, right? And all of that's kind of tying the whole thing together. But to go back to your question about the tribes and the question of whether there's competition between tribes, what would be, how would you start to think about that? You want to answer your own question? When you say competition, how would that look?
They'd be competing for land in Israel.
You could say they could be competing for land. Just based on this story, what would you learn about that competition? Could you learn anything about such competition from this story?
Fueled by their ancestry.
Okay, fueled by their ancestry. Give me more detail. What kind of ancestry? What do you know about their ancestry?
You know who their mothers are.
You know who their mothers are. I was fishing and I caught something, right? So, right, but that I was leading the witness. But you got it. That's what I mean, right? So you do, and in a way, I think that's what you were assuming when you said that there's competition between the sons. So in fact, this story gives you, or proposes to you, a very interesting set of details about these characters as tribes, in that it sets them up with different sorts of status. So somebody else, I mean, what do you do with that status? Like, who do you think has the most status in this story? Okay, somebody said the first son, so that would be Reuben, which is kind of funny because Reuben's not that major a character. So I'm going to go to the left one of you. Go ahead, in the white shirt.
I would say Joseph, probably because he was kind of the most wanted child, I would say.
Yeah.
Perspective.
So So I go with that too, but totally taking into account what you said about the firstborn, because in terms of tradition, you'd expect the firstborn to have the most standing. But of course, there is this weird thing in that he's the firstborn of the wrong wife. So in another way, Joseph is also a firstborn of Rachel. And certainly the way the story sets it up, although interestingly, you feel a lot of sympathy for Leah, because Rachel is both loved and happy in that way, and also kind of nasty, right? I mean, this whole thing about give me children or I'll die, or sons or I'll die. And yet, there's this sense, it almost isn't about Rachel, it's about Jacob. That Jacob himself, that from the beginning, the wife that he wanted was Rachel. He saw her from the very beginning of chapter 28, I guess it is, 29, and he falls in love with her, and he just goes straight to her father and says, I want to marry your daughter. And he says, oh, yeah, eventually, 7 years later. And then when they arrange the marriage, he gives her the other daughter on the sly, like, waits till they're really drunk after the reception or whatever, and thinks that he won't notice somehow, which apparently is true until later. And so, then he has to make a deal for Rachel. I mean, so from Jacob's point of view, it's been a rough ride, whether or not Rachel was really worth it. So yeah, in the end, I do think that the story is set up to present Joseph as the long-awaited son that Jacob wanted. Like, forget just Rachel, that Jacob wanted. And so that's interesting. So if you ask yourself in the framework of this story, who is the favored son, it would be Joseph. And if you look at the structure of Genesis as a whole, it kind of plays out that way, because who's the son who gets special attention in the storyline? It ends up being that there's a long story at the end of the book of Genesis about how the Israelites ended up in Egypt. That's going to also explain how they need to come out of Egypt later. And it's about Joseph, who, gets kind of beat up on by his brothers and thrown in a pit and then sold off, to some traveling merchants who take him to Egypt, where it turns out that God looks after him and he comes out okay, very much okay. Ends up working high up in the Pharaoh administration, and ends up bringing his family there and takes care of them, and everything's great. So that's interesting, right? Both that Joseph's the long-awaited, and then Joseph's the one that's the center of attention in the storyline when you move to the next phase. So, yeah, in this sort of scrap heap or whatever, Joseph is the long-awaited. He's the first status. Who would you say is next? Yeah, go ahead.
Judah.
That's interesting. So he said Judah. Judah is the fourth of the first four. And it's a good question what to do with that. Does that make him also kind of long-awaited? In a way, it's surprising that Judah wasn't number one. That, Reuben's number one, Judah's not number one. I have opinions about why that might be the case. But the reason why you might expect Judah is that Judah is going to be the eponymous ancestor of the whole kingdom of Judah, which is the last kingdom left standing, and is the eponymous ancestor of the Jews, you could say, right, even by that name. And so, yeah, Judah should be really important, yeah?
Dan?
And
Dan?
so what makes you say Dan?
Because he's the first son through Bilhah, which is kind of through Rachel.
So that's an interesting question. I mean, I wouldn't have gone there, but it's logical. I see what you're saying, right? I mean, so he's the first one that Rachel kind of gets. So then the question is, how do you play this? Go ahead.
Benjamin.
Well, so Benjamin is a funny case because Benjamin isn't even in the chapter. He's the missing one. But he is also going to be Rachel's. He's going to be Rachel's other son. And he doesn't show up till chapter 35 when, after Jacob has returned from Syria to back in the land, and then she gets pregnant one more time, it says, and has the son and dies having him. Great. But at least from Jacob's point of view, again, he's got this other son from Rachel. And in the Joseph story, Benjamin has this special role. So it's a good answer, although got to be careful because he's not in the story. So in a funny sort of way, there's a sense that Benjamin's kind of been added into the story because the person back there had said that, Joseph really looks like the long-awaited. He's the hero. You almost don't need Benjamin. But then the funny thing is, if you don't need Benjamin in the story itself, there's only 11 tribes. So one thing that leads me to suspect is that the original story here might not have had even 11 sons. It might have had fewer than 11 sons, and somebody's topped off the number to get 12. And they topped it off by adding the Benjamin story later, making sure you have the 12th one. They topped it off by adding that little comment about, the double blessing or naming little saying that goes with Joseph, where the second one says, oh yeah, I need another one. And then the question is whether they topped it off with any of the other names. And we won't go there. We just won't get into it. But it's quite possible. So meanwhile, leaving that aside, you have to play with issues of status. Like after Judah is a son of Leah, but there are 5 other sons of Leah. So are those 6 tribes relatively higher status because at least they're the sons of Jacob's first wife? Or do you go over to the sort of Bilhah, those 2, which are what, Dan and Naphtali or something like that, because at least they're associated with Rachel. And so the bottom of the pecking order are Zilpah's sons because they're not Rachel and they're not even Leah. Interestingly, if you look at old texts from the Bible, texts that are arguably, that go back a long way, some of these those 4, maidservant tribes turn out to be really central to Israel and who Israel was. They just didn't get much credit, and there's a whole story behind that. Go ahead.
What would be the motivation for adding in extra characters?
Well, so the for one, it would be that there are that in some cases it's that there are other people that need to be explained, and that by putting them all the way back to Jacob, you can say, look, they go back to the very beginning of Israel. One example would be Levi. Right, so from a tribal point of view, Levi is not a tribe. I mean, it's not a group. It's an identification of a group of people of a kind of priestly caste, you could almost say. And so they don't hold territory. They aren't a tribe politically in the same sense at all. They don't act as a unit politically. There's no tradition that they did, even though there is a tradition that there was such a group, and it's probably quite old. So. And one could say that the Levites were included from the very beginning. I'm not saying automatically that the Levites must have been added, but just as an example of why one could look to Levi as a possible addition would be that Levi is a different kind of tribe. It's the only one that's kind of not a regular tribe, and so somebody would have said, wait a minute, they got to be on the list, and stick them in. That's the kind of question you'd ask. But again, the way I'm framing the argument, the starting point for imagining the possibility that the membership in this group might have shifted is the fact that there are only 11 in this story, when in all the biblical tradition more broadly, they're very serious about making sure there are 12. And they'll make adjustments to the lists always to make sure there are 12. And even this one has been adjusted, in a sense, with the final blessing to say, oh, and don't forget, there's going to be one more, and that's going to be Benjamin, even though he's not in the story. So Yeah, keep that in mind. Now, we've got like 5 minutes left. Let me give you my own list. And again, on purpose, I let this discussion of the actual text take a good part of the class because I want to do this with you, right? I want our class sessions to be this kind of conversation about actual material. And I really like your observations, your line of thought. I like things you said about the story, and I like the direction with asking the question about the tribes. And the kind of, there's a unity in a sense at both levels, right? There's a unity as a story with the competition of Jacob and, or rather Rachel and Leah as wives of Jacob. And then there's also unity in terms of giving you this picture of a batch of tribes with different status and how that might relate to later political situations, all very interesting. Now, I've got 2 main points that I'm going to want you to take out of this. And it's going to end up, I'm going to probably miss the map and the Mari stuff, but it's how it goes, but thank you. So the first thing to say, this is still not my 2 points, right? Before I get to say my 2 points, anthropologists study what they call tribal societies. And when they talk about tribal societies, what they're talking about in particular are groups of people on a fairly large scale that understand themselves to be related by kinship, which means family ties. And these, anthropologists have gone and lived with all sorts of people. They sometimes live in, backcountry sorts of places and in little groups, but they also can be very large groups of people that live in cities and towns. They can be, spread across parts of the Middle East or Africa or places like that and live in different places, but they know they're related because they understand themselves to have a family connection. And so tribal societies are understood according to these family ties. One of the strange things about anthropological study of tribal societies is everybody talks about ancestry and kinship, and yet there are very, very few actual stories or pictures of kind of tribal organizations that are arranged as a family, and where you have the actual family setup. Here's the starting point. Here are the groups within. They're all related as brothers. So from this point of view, as a reader of the Bible, if any of you ever have read the Bible, then you think, oh, this is just how it works, right? This is the story of Genesis. That's how you would do kinship. And yet, this is an amazing resource for studying tribal people, the tribal idea, because it gives you an actual scenario where it literally takes all the different groups, the tribes, that they imagine to make up this early Israel, and it relates them through a specific story as sons of one father, even by 4 different mothers. It makes this elaborate scenario. This is amazing. And this is the important history in Genesis. Above everything else, what is so important about Genesis is what I'll call an interpretive claim by the writers of Genesis that ancient Israel was tribal, that it was a family, that it could be, that all its parts could be understood by their family relationship. So when I point you back to Petard, right? Petard never said a thing about this, right? Everything he had to say about how you understood the late Bronze Age was about empires and kingdoms and cities and small, weak city-states. Right? Where were the tribes? Were there none? Surely there were. And in fact, even when you go back to some of that same evidence, like the Eponymous stuff, I have a student who's finishing a dissertation right now doing just that sort of reevaluation that is not focused on tribes per se, but builds a kind of different picture that shows you where they would be in this stuff. So, it's whatever, the people who wrote these texts to Egypt and whatnot, they didn't need to know who the tribes were by name and stuff like that. They weren't interested. They were little kings in their cities and their centers, and they just didn't talk about those details. And yet, this site called Mari actually does, for some strange, unique reason. They really want you to know about tribal identities and how they're related to each other. Well, Genesis belongs with that. Genesis is like Mari in its text, that the writers of this book want you to know that these people that we're talking about are tribal and they're related in this way. So now I'm really out of time. Here are my 2 points. Number 1, Israel is a family of related tribes. Israel is a family of related tribes. This is what Genesis is telling you. We would not know this from outside the Bible. We would not know it from archaeology. And yet I would argue that it's historically important and, at some level historically true. It's probably very, very old in its characterization of Israel, right? Like Israel as a tribal people probably preceded the existence of kings. Surely that's true historically. And Genesis tells us that. It's not the only place in the Bible that tells us that, but it does. And it gives an explanation for it. Also, the book of Judges presents Israel as having various tribes, but it doesn't give you the family connection. Genesis gives you the kinship. It actually gives you what the anthropologists say should be there. It's great history. And my second point, which is sort of by the by, and I don't know if I'll come back to it, but is that Genesis says that the people of Israel did not just come from the local land, but that they have a kind of tribal connection to the lands far to the north. That's where all these people were born, right? That all of the sons of Jacob up to Joseph are said to be born in Syria. His wife's from Syria. That's where he's living all that time. And there's this deep claim of a connection with Syria. And that's what I don't have time to get to, all right? So, but my one point is so important. And so when somebody says, well, what do you think, or what does Professor Fleming think about history and Genesis, you can tell them he likes it. And that's why, all right? See you next time.